Protagonists. We've heard of them, we've seen them around, but today I want to dissect the different kinds of protagonists in video games and see what's the difference between main character versus the main character. Disclaimer, these are personal opinions and will be focused on the lens of the characters that I do know, so sorry Kalis, I don't play HSR. Also, this isn't a comparison between the games themselves or even the characters themselves, just a dissection of the archetype that they represent. Anyway, let's begin. What is a protagonist? I like defining a protagonist as the character we see the world through. They're basically our eyes into the story, and whatever happens in the story happens around them because they're the point of view we're basically stuck with. Think of the story progression like a camera stuck to the back of one person. Everywhere that person goes, the camera follows. Sure, the camera can see other people, but it's almost always through the lens of the protagonist. Bonus points if we get to hear their inner thoughts and voices to further the narrative. So there's actually a good question of, are you the main character because the world revolves around you? Or does the world revolve around you because you're the main character? Also, there's a very big difference between protagonist and hero. A protagonist does not immediately mean someone good or moral, and might not even mean someone that's willing to go through the change to be a good person. Conversely, an antagonist is simply someone that opposes the protagonist's goals and ideals, but that doesn't mean they're inherently bad or evil either. However, in video games, protagonists play a much more complex role. In movies, TV shows, and books, they're probably just another character that the audiences get attached to, but hardly with any other intervention on their end. For example, if Katniss wanted to join the Hunger Games for her sister, our job as an audience is to just watch her and get invested along the way. However, video games show us a new level of design, interaction. Now we control what the protagonists do or say, and even how they fight, live, and be happy. And the first kind of protagonist that I want to dissect is when we have total control. Introducing the silent protagonists. Silent protagonists are main characters that have little to no vocal point or interactivity in the story that are separate from you, the player. Silent protagonists are meant to be surrogates for the player to insert themselves into, an instrument so that the player can see the world for themselves without any intervention. They have almost no written personality that's completely unique to them, so players can project whatever they want onto this blank frame. Though, there are a lot of times where the silent protagonist has a simple backstory to explain why they're there and what their end goal is. One example of this is Chell from Portal, where you wake up as a mute test subject trying to survive a facility filled with deadly scientific experiments, or Frisk from Undertale, where you play as a fallen child that found themselves in a mysterious underground world filled with monsters. That's not to say that silent protagonists are poorly written characters though, or that they're not loved by the players either. Silent protagonists are great instruments for bridging the player and the story, especially if the story's goal is to feel more personal and connected to the player, whether it's fear, knowledge, or care and love. But there's an evolution to the silent protagonist that I think we're all familiar with. Think the Persona series. You have characters that are silent for a majority of the story, even when they have voice actors, and you only have their limited character dialogue options to determine their personality, but most of the time, outside of cutscenes, they're relatively quiet. And this is what I'd like to call the main character. They're the focal point of the story, they're significant to the story, but they're not actually that big of a character themselves. So what would I define as a main character? In my opinion, a main character is a poster protagonist that fills in the role of the silent protagonist while simultaneously being a bit more developed as their own individual person. Main characters are the center of the story as we watch them grow and develop, but they're not as developed or vocal as the other characters the game may want to emphasize. This works best if it's a story-driven game where our primary goal is to learn about the other people in the world rather than of ourselves. The main character is sometimes seen as a symbol and a caricature of the narrative instead of an actual character, which isn't exactly a bad thing, and I want to dissect this role from the Travelers of Genshin Impact. The Travelers themselves don't usually talk throughout the stories, except for crucial moments that are integral to their character. In previous updates, the Traveler has also been delegated to the support protagonist role, where their personality is flexible enough that the player can project their own dialogue and ideas into them without any problems. This also is coupled by the fact that the Traveler doesn't actually speak all that much. The Traveler is relatively relaxed when interacting with characters and does exhibit some quirks here and there that may spice up the dialogue. However, dialogue options in Genshin rarely have any kind of impact in the main story and even how the character responds. Sometimes you can be presented with two choices and the character is going to respond with the same thing either way, which can definitely drill down the travelers, and subsequently the players, lack of protagonist agency even more. It is also important to emphasize how voice and speaking are such integral parts in forming a character. The player input is all they have to respond, and that can cause a cognitive dissonance when attempting to separate the character's dialogue authentically from the player choosing it. It's also important to note that Lumine and Aether are almost completely interchangeable except for a few line discrepancies from certain characters or certain events. Because of the lack of voices and distinct dialogue from either of them, they can almost feel like cutouts meant to just bring the player into this world. However, what differentiates the main character from the silent protagonist is that there is a semblance of a predetermined personality for them. The Traveler, for example, has loads of voice lines talking about their opinions on things, and especially recent events. Extended content like animated shows or movies can also flesh out the main character more outside of what the player would usually have in terms of the dialogue options. It's also important to note that the main character can have a lot of moments where the dialogue choices coalesce into one thought, because that's the only valid dialogue for that situation. One great example of player versus character dissonance is when a lot of players were mad at the Traveler for choosing to distrust Linny and Lynette after the two of them shared a very devastating story about their past. Other moments also include the Traveler completely taking over the dialogue to give their thoughts on the matter. The Traveler, while being a stand-in most of the time in the regular game, also has extensive lore and history about their past that is separate from player knowledge. This was the case in the previous Archon quests, where it was revealed that they had information about Conria that the player wasn't aware of. The Travelers are also Outlanders from other mysterious worlds that was destroyed a long time ago before they arrived to Devat. All in all, the Traveler is a great example of a character that pivots between player stand-in versus an active character. The uniqueness of protagonists like them is that they're malleable, depending on what the situation needs, and it's important to respect Paimon's role is basically being the Traveler's voice. But now we move on to shifting that concept into the main character, and my recent interest with Zenless Zone Zero brings me to my favorite protagonists in a while, Weiss and Belle. These two act as a unit together and are as fleshed out and engaging as the other characters that we meet along the story. As a player, we do have the usual player prompts on what to say, but the characters say something different depending on their personality. Even if we pick the completely same options while playing the other sibling, we're treated to a whole new interaction altogether. As a companion, the sibling's dialogue is also different. Weiss is presented as the calmer of the two, with more verbose manners of speech and a matter-of-fact presentation of his thoughts. Conversely, Belle is much more hyper and casual with her interactions, even criticizing her brother for being so uptight. What makes them different from Aether and Lumine is that the story treats them like characters and integrates them organically into conversations with others. It really feels like Weiss or Belle is talking to them instead of us. One benefit for characterization like this is that it can make players feel like they have a companion in the form of the protagonist. Instead of seeing the protagonist like a blank slate, it's like going through hell with your best friend. Or conversely, if the players want to feel like their actions have meaning, hearing the characters speak and the others appropriately responding can increase the feeling of perceived player agency. Because hey, our dialogue choices matter, even if it isn't by a lot. Though there is a downside to this kind of characterization. It's that the protagonist is now a subject of scrutiny, much like any other character. They now play by the rules of literary protagonists, movie protagonists, instead of the somewhat safety net that silent protagonists have. There was an interesting phenomenon that I observed with silent characters versus main characters that comes with players criticizing them. Players tended to be more critical of main characters partially because silent characters had so little information to even be criticized on. But for main characters, you can criticize if you don't like a character's dialogue, how they said it, what they did, or even just their own personality. That and silent characters, because by proxy they're us, felt a bit more forgivable to the player since you're supposed to see yourselves in that character. Now, are any of these archetypes better than the other? I personally think that it's a matter of how you use the tools that you've got. How you write your video game protagonist needs to be appropriate to the story and execution that you're planning to do. And that's why a lot of combat-packed games either have silent characters or characters that are usually surrounded by others to complement their antics. That's also why dating games have silent protagonists, because you want to feel immersed as a player. You want to feel like they actually like you. It's a matter of adjustment depending on the genre. On one hand, the Traveler's silence and malleability works wonders in a story that has a lot of characters and relationships that exist outside of their intervention. And it also complements how much these people talk. It complements the amount of dialogue that other characters have around them. The Traveler's role, and subsequently our role as a player, is to be an active listener and witness the world around you. Genshin's open world elements requires this level of escapism when you have a character that minimally intervenes in the dialogue, so that we, as the players, can put in our own 2 cents and thoughts. It's also appreciated in character by the people that they're talking to. The Traveler was written to have a more quiet and mellow personality to complement the characters that either talk a lot or the characters that don't talk at all and prefer the silence. On the other hand, Weiss and Belle's stories are more conversational, relaxed, and focused on them as individuals going through life, because Zenless Zone Zero is a slice of lifestyle narrative. Giving each of the siblings a voice also builds the dynamic with each other well, because now we have a genuine banter and quips between the two that don't feel forced by the player. It genuinely feels like we're a third friend of the group watching it rather than substituting one of the siblings. All in all, your protagonist needs to properly reflect what you actually need in the story. Anyway, my name is Aster and thank you for chilling with me. Bye-bye!